Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our panel discussion on the nexus of climate change, human security, and terrorism. We will be looking at how climate change is exacerbating existing drivers, how multilateralism and reimagining hard power can help us to find solutions. My name is Cholpan Rozobekova. I'm a director of the Bulan Institute for Peace Innovations and honored to moderate this event. Today, we are living in a time where the intersection of climate change and human security demands our utmost attention. As we witness the impacts of climate change are unfolding, and it becomes clear that climate change is not merely an environmental issue, but a multifaceted challenge that spans geopolitical, economic, and security dimensions. Our discussion today is anchored on the policy paper published by Women Without Borders, which underscores the urgent need to rethink traditional security paradigm when climate change is reshaping global security landscapes. The paper argues that traditional approaches to security centered on military capabilities alone may be insufficient in addressing the complex and interconnected threats posed by climate change. Today, this event is organized by the Bulan Institute for Peace Innovations via peace-building organization based in Geneva. And today we are privileged to have with us a distinguished panel of experts, each bringing unique perspectives and insights to this critical discourse. And to all participants, welcome to the event. Thank you for registering. And please keep your microphone and cameras off for the entirety of the discussion. We will have a Q&A session by the end, and where you can ask a question or make a comment. So let's begin our dialogue with opening remarks from Dr. Edith Slaffer, founder and chair of Women Without Borders. Dr. Slaffer is Ashoka Fellow, Advisory Council member at Omega Women's Leadership Center in New York. And she is the recipient of numerous international awards, such as Foreign Policy's 100 Global Thinkers, the Grand Decoration Honor in Gold for services to the Republic of Austria for lifelong learning, and also Soar Optimist International of Europe Peace Prize and other awards. Dr. Slaffer, thank you for joining us, and our appreciation to your organization for raising the critical issues and publishing this important paper. The floor is yours.
So good afternoon to everybody. Thank you to the Bulan Institute and Ms. Rozobekova for hosting this timely event, providing a platform to discuss the recent Women Without Borders policy paper, this excellent policy paper, I must add, written by Tom Wuchte and Rehema Said Obui. Hi. We are at a crucial turning point in our fight against climate change. And it's not just about melting ice caps and rising sea levels anymore. Climate change is shaking up global stability, fueling resource conflicts, displacing communities, and deepening socio-economic divides. For example, did you know that since 2008, an average of 21.5 million people have been displaced each year due to climate-related disasters? I think that's huge. Women are at the front lines, tackling both climate change and violent extremism. And now I talk a little bit about our work. As mothers, caregivers, and community leaders, women bring unique insights and strengths to these battles. Empowering women in that context is not just the right thing to do, it's smart and strategic. A recent study by the International Union for Conservation of Nature found that when women are involved in managing natural resources, outcomes are more effective and sustainable. In Kenya, women-led water conservation projects have drastically improved water access, reducing stress and conflicts. In Bangladesh, women-led initiatives have made a significant impact in reducing household vulnerability to climate impacts. And these projects include building raised homes to avoid flooding and setting up early warning systems for extreme weather. These efforts have proven to be life-saving. And it's not just about the grassroots work, but also at the policy level. Women's advocacy has been instrumental in pushing for inclusive and sustainable climate policies, which is crucial for long-term stability. Players like, and she's one of the most prominent figures, Mary Robinson, who were challenging state stakeholders at COP in Abu Dhabi. That was very, very brave of her. Before I hand over to Tom and Rahima, who has not yet arrived, but we hope to see her here, I want to go more into detail about the recommendations and ideas in the policy paper, and to Mr. Wood to provide more insights. Before doing that, I would like to give you all a glimpse into our work at Without Borders and also provide a few anecdotes from our programs that support the notion that the link between climate change and human security deserves more attention and above all more resources, both from hard power and a soft power standpoint. So we're at Without Borders. We are a non-profit organization working worldwide with a mission to build the social capital of women. From Bangladesh to South India to Indonesia, Zanzibar, the Western Balkans, Austria, Germany, Belgium, we work with mothers and also with fathers in local communities to strengthen their confidence and their competence to challenge systemic structures of gender-based violence and the threat of extremist ideologies. Our focus is to build local level capacity and resilience in communities that are vulnerable to extremism, specifically by harnessing the untapped potential of parents. We developed 2 flagship family-based prevention programs. That's the mother schools and the father schools, the Parenting for Peace models. They both emerged from multi-country research studies conducted by our organization to probe the extent to which parents are the missing link in the whole of society prevention architecture. So the mother schools trains and positions mothers as the first line of defense against violent extremism in their homes and in their communities. Participants develop their confidence and competence to recognize and address the early warning signs of radicalizations in their everyday environments. The program also, and I think this is increasingly important, has a strong intergenerational empowerment component by unlocking the role model potential of mothers and giving rise to networks of like-minded prevention actors. Today, we have rolled out the mother schools and father schools programs in 17 geographies, an impact of approximately 6,000 parents in vulnerable communities who have been completing the program. So I kind of made you aware of what we are doing, and you might think, where does this all fit in with today's discussion? Many of the geographies where we work, from South India, Kerala to Bangladesh to Zanzibar in East Africa, are experiencing severe climate-attributed weather events at a higher frequency, and thus increasing their overall communal vulnerability and susceptibility to other phenomena such as violent extremism and organized crime. To give you some anecdotes from the ground, I hope this will help to set the scene for the discussion today and provide some insights into what more resources and attention need to go into addressing this dangerous nexus between climate change and human security, and why community prevention programs are key for ensuring security and supporting resilience. We have implemented a number of mother schools rounds in Kerala in India, especially along the coastal areas, which see high rates of addiction, alcoholism, low education levels, and a prevalence of violence. These communities also faced annual floodings and rising sea levels due to climate change, which means heightened instability and higher levels of poverty. Every year, whole communities and households experience severe flooding, forcing families to evacuate their homes for months, moving either to makeshift refugee camps or relatives' homes. To quote some of the conversations we have had, quote, "Every 3 to 4 months, we have to leave our home and be in a refugee camp because of the water. We cannot stay in our house. The safety of my children is in crisis. I want my children to have a safe and secure life. When the erosion happens, we go to this camp, but everybody stays in one big hall with few toilets. The safety and security is not there. Lots of strange people. There are people who are not from our area. We do not feel this is safe for our children," unquote. The rising sea levels also impact many of the families' livelihoods. Most of the husbands are fishermen, so when extreme weather or flooding takes place, they have no other means or ways of supporting the family, and then turning frequently to alcohol and drug abuse. All of these push and pull factors and grievances combined with the devastation brought on by climate change create an incredibly vulnerable environment, one that is perfect breeding ground for recruitment into extremism, organized crime, and violence. We see similar patterns in other communities we work, for example, in Bangladesh or in Zanzibar, which are also experiencing severe weather events, from monsoon to flooding to extreme temperatures, further exacerbating already festering grievances such as lack of opportunity, poverty, access of education. In Zanzibar, where we have both mother schools and father schools, flooding has become more common in recent years. The rising sea levels are also expected to have a more dramatic impact on the island in the coming years, uprooting families, affecting livelihoods, and creating a general climate of fear. So, to wrap up, the findings of this policy paper highlight the urgent need to address the interconnected nature of climate change and violent extremism. Women with their unique roles and perspectives are key in this effort. By empowering women and integrating their contributions into policy frameworks, we can build more resilient and more peaceful communities. The evidence is clear. Women-led initiatives are transforming communities and creating lasting change. Whether it's in Bangladesh, in Kenya, India, when women lead, the benefits ripple out, building resilience and sustainability at a broader scale. Let's seize this moment to act decisively. Together, we can turn the challenge of climate change and extremism into opportunities to sustainable development and lasting peace. So I thank you for your attention, and I will now turn over to Tom, who will elaborate on the policy paper findings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Slaffer. It's indeed the number of displaced people are growing due to the climate change, and especially women in communities also having really affected by the climate change. And also climate change, as you said, is contributing to the organized crime, terrorism, and exacerbating poverty and other social issues. And thank you for your amazing work among communities and empowering women. Now I think it's time to look into the policy paper itself, which makes very interesting arguments. The authors argue that interplay between terrorism, organized crime, and climate change needs our full attention, and traditional security capacity building is not enough. So according to the paper, these are interconnected security concerns, and non-traditional and traditional threats together act as a Molotov cocktail. So we supposed to have both co-authors, but I hope Reshima can join soon, because in Kenya, as you know, the security situation is not stable these days, and we hope she can join during the discussion. So I'm going to invite one of the co-authors, Mr. Thomas Vukte, who is with us today. Thank you for joining. Mr. Thomas Vukte is the founder of the Center for Multilateral Collaboration and Cooperation Leadership based in Washington. He worked as the executive director for the International Institute for Justice and Rule of Law based in Malta. Before that, he was a head of counterterrorism issues at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in Vienna. Thomas Vukte is a recipient of the Department of State's highest award for excellence in international security affairs. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Vukte. Could you give us a general picture on the nexus of climate change, human security, and terrorism, security implications in general, and why we need to change our approach in hard and soft security resources sharing? Floor is yours.
Thank you, Topan, and thank you to my colleagues that are joining me on this call today, Edith, who helped us get this policy paper published, my co-author, Reshima, and it's nice to meet Newfall. I'm pleased to be part of the Bulan Institute's work, and I also recently joined them on their advisory board, and it's primarily concentrated on Central Asia, which is a region which is not escaping climate change in and of itself. So I would start off by saying I have no solution to put down on the floor for this discussion, except that it has seized me, which is great UN language, and the sort of the impetus of this is I spent the better part of the last decade plus as a person leading several teams focused on the fight against terrorism, capacity building, and all the things that came after really going back to the early 2000s with the 9/11 attacks. A lot of things went wrong in that aspect, and a lot of things went right, and it's grown into an enormous counterterrorism architecture, as well as, at the same time, around then, the Conference of the Parties for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was getting started up to address climate change. Now, if you're a student of both the work in violent extremism, sort of internal security, and issues around human security and climate change, about 20 years ago, there was a few articles talking about violent extremists and climate change. Anecdotally, I would say that much of the discussion sort of tapered off because the international community became very seized with the several wars that took place against ISIS and the issues surrounding, first, the foreign terrorist fighters going into the conflict areas, and then the foreign terrorist fighters coming back from the conflict areas, and then the rise of lone wolf attacks or attacks targeted by people that were motivated by the siren call to perpetuate violent extremism. And there are a whole host of great non-governmental organizations and civil society that are working on all these issues. I sort of had an epiphany as the executive director and the head of the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law when the pandemic hit. And I realized, somewhat obviously to many of us, but maybe we weren't thinking about it, is that there are a whole host of issues that are exacerbating the rise of violent extremism, of which one, not the exclusive one, is climate change, but it became a very good one to sort of wrap our heads around where are we going? And if you're a student of the UN system, the UN has this giant counterterrorism strategy from the General Assembly with 4 pillars. 80%, in my humble opinion, has been focused on passing measures to counter the rise of violent extremism and delivering capacity building. I would say the solution to the nexus of human security, climate change, the role of women, which I'm a big fan of Edith's work, is not so easily solved. And it really goes to what they call Pillar 1 in the UN system, which is addressing the conditions conducive to terrorism. And I started thinking about maybe where are we going with all of this, and what is the off-ramp from the war on terrorism that can maybe rebalance some of our efforts that we can address all of this in a better way. And everybody likes to throw out whole of government approach, a holistic approach. I'm not going to throw those words out at you. I understand that, but it's much more complicated than that. So where does this paper take us? And I'm glad to see Rashima has made it on the call. Great partner in this effort, which provides a real grassroots level thing. I left the IIJ, and this was the area I wanted to start thinking about. What is the relationship between traditional and non-traditional security concerns, non-traditional climate change, pandemics, deforestation, poverty, etc.? And how can we make it maybe perhaps more reasoned and better as we go through? Now, the topic du jour with nearly every conversation right now is about climate change. When I look back at this is reminiscent of the early 2010s, when social media empowered much of the violent extremist recruitment, and then digital posts left law enforcement with evidence regarding the rise of ISIS and its brief kinetic advance to create a caliphate. Much effort was used to address responsible understanding of the complexities. Similar concerns carry over now today about how to address the climate change and security nexus. I sort of got my thoughts together, and other people are working on this as well. But I was very fortunate in September of last year to be on a panel on the margins of the UN General Assembly with my good partners, the Global Community Resilience Engagement Fund, where we first talked about climate change. And there were some speakers from the traditional Western people that often tend to deliver capacity building. And then there were 3 or 4 speakers, I remember off the top of my head, Iraq, Mali, and Niger. And I walked away from that conversation as there is a need to unpack, I like that word, this issue, and also to make sure that it had the perspective of what's really happening at the grassroots. And I focused in on the African region, which of course many know is at the epicenter right now in the Sahel with a lot of the violent extremist issues. And so that's how Rashima and I got connected together. I knew her from the International Institute. But, you know, against this backdrop, to look at the interplay between terrorism, organized crime, and climate change, and specifically how they appear to be fueling violent extremism, and it warrants our full attention. And again, I would underscore at the beginning of my presentation, I'm not suggesting that this is the sole driver of anything, but it merits looking at. And from that General Assembly meeting, the initial reaction I got when I discussed this with a couple of like-minded people from the Global Counterterrorism Forum, which looks at a whole host of issues, oftentimes before the UN can address them, because it is not a fully consensus-based agreement. Sometimes they can throw it out there to get some discussion going. The initial reaction was, I'm not sure there's much to talk about between climate change and violent extremism. However, if you follow the Global Counterterrorism Forum, a couple of weeks ago, Rashima and I had the privilege of presenting our paper in a much shorter version because the Global Counterterrorism Forum has picked up the issue of the nexus of climate change and violent extremism, and they're looking at how to come up with some approaches to this. Now, there are many in the African region identifying current evidence as the nexus between climate fragility and vulnerability to violent extremism. And I tend to use the word violent extremism over terrorism, because terrorism, what I've also learned, I've pitched this paper to a lot of climate change people, and there is really not a lot of knowledge and collaboration going on between terrorism practitioners and climate change, who have a much bigger thing going on with COP 29, 30 coming up, and so on. But it does point out that climate change has exacerbated factors, and there is, I think, an important focus for the consideration of non-traditional security threats as a bigger part of, are we being empathetic to the issues on the ground as we are continuing to be in this fight against terrorism? And the main areas that we are trying to examine is, what is the current evidence linking climate and violent extremism? Is there a direct linkage, or is its effect mediated by other factors? I don't think anybody in the Q&A here is going to say there's a direct linkage, and I'm not proposing that. And how will climate change affect patterns in radicalization and recruitment? And what should we try to know more in terms of this relationship? And I would underscore all those 4 questions is, I'm feeling an urgency that we don't fall into the trap of, we need more research papers and we need more studies. I think you will find, as you read through the policy paper or you just discuss with other people, there's a lot of direct evidence that it's the same push and pull factors, great term everybody likes to use in the PCBE world, that are similar under what's happening with climate change. Now, what is the real underlying issue that I think we should be concerned about is that there's a common theme that we face requiring a resolve to action. But the question being asked in our policy paper is whether we are mortgaging our future by not focusing on the impact of climate change and how it affects such areas as conflict, gender-based violence, and disaffected youth who are most vulnerable. A recent article questions whether within foreign policy overall, that's a big area, the agenda is one of extinction. Now, I don't want to try to scare people, but at the moment when the imperatives of survival demand unprecedented global cooperation for things like climate change, the question preoccupying many is over how many kinetic conflicts to consider. So there's a great article that I referred to. I referred to a recent article, but I just would quote from this. It said, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which issued its most recent warning in late 2022, should have galvanized a sane society into historic action. But what do we have today, really? There's a bipartisan consensus for denying technology and markets as we militarize. There's an interference with the war in and around Ukraine, and there is a security apparatus that's generally on board for a strategy known as great power competition. But yet in the background, if you really worry about non-traditional threats, are we mortgaging our future to move on this? Now, one would have hoped the better part of humanity would have come out the other side of the COVID pandemic with a renewed sense of purpose, tackling such challenges as climate change, lifting poverty conditions within developing countries, while solving water deficits and forming collective approaches to the loss of natural habitats. Now, the past several years added fuel to some of the decisions we made after 9/11 in the responses to terrorism and violent extremism, and it did fuel what made me start thinking about it. It uninterrupted stay-at-home time to receive really good, dense information that is fueling these current disagreements in politics, now powered by climate change that creates yet another nexus of concern along with these other issues. And I'm also not naive, and I think it's probably going to come up in the Q&A. I understand not everybody shares the same view of what is the driving factors with non-traditional security issues like climate change. But as the Horn of Africa and the Sahel grapple with pervasive security threats, terrorism and climate change are working in alarming harmony. Yet early warning detection mechanisms and conflict analysis are, I believe, failing to adequately capture this relationship with a plan that addresses the conditions conducive to terrorism. And Rashima can give a real on-the-ground view of this. And I would like to also say to Rashima, my thoughts are with you today as we know the protests that are going on in Kenya. Now, research recommendations are increasingly proposing climate-related disasters and recruitment trends can be tackled in tandem by addressing grievances and vulnerabilities, especially at the local level. That in a broad brush, as we say in American slang, captures one of the main thrusts of the policy perspectives. Some of the articles that we read and that we cited in our paper, climate change is exacerbating a series of existing factors. Climate change, there is an indirect link between the phenomena in the Lake Chad Basin, as well as combined with food security, rapid population growth, and poor governance. And I think these are important issues, and there were no lack of articles making this connection. So again, I said at the beginning of my presentation, should we fall into the trap of saying we need lots more research? I would suggest what we should fall into the trap of, we need lots more action. We need to really figure out how can we take this approach to violent extremism and counterterrorism where people like Edith that are on the ground doing the work can really help us focus on minimizing the conditions conducive to terrorism so that we're not doing all of this capacity building for the next 20 years with somewhat a similar approach. Synergies between terrorism, organized crime, and climate change are favoring a rise in violent extremism. Now, the Nexus work will help us to reconsider, which is sort of the end part, and then I'm going to turn it over to Rashima, our spending priorities, which the paper touches lightly, but I think it's an area which is uncomfortable to discuss, that still focus too heavily on traditional hard security issues, military preparedness, non-proliferation, arms control, disarmament, counterterrorism. If resources were to be reallocated to reflect current climate developments and other non-traditional threats, there are resource limitations that can be overcome by enlisting traditional security organizations to add climate change to their portfolio of work and requesting that they burden share by reallocating funds to address the range of underlying conditions and root causes. There will be a net loss in some pocketbooks of these issues. But if we continue doing same over and over again, we will not build community resilience. And you will hear from Rashima how urgent the need is for community resilience on the ground. And in closing, beyond merely shifting our security focus, we must revive the culture of cooperation among international multilateral security organizations to break up this harmonious relationship that is developing between climate change and violent extremism. It is a risk multiplier, and it's important to continue raising public awareness. And I'm doing everything I can with Rashima, with Bulan Institute, with others to try to make at least some understanding that we should really be seized of this issue. I believe that is my allotted time, Chulpan, and I'm very pleased to pass the floor over, and I hope Rashima has a good connectivity as we go into this. And I did notice in the chat room that we are being recorded and that the recording can be shared later so other people can listen to it. So thank you. I will silence myself now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas Bukta. So as you said, addressing the issues conducive to terrorism is the key, and one of them is climate change. We need a holistic approach. There are synergies between most of the security concerns, but while there is no consensus on the climate change exacerbating effects among policymakers, some state officials, but people on the ground in the communities, they are seeing real impact, adverse effects, and then how the climate change exacerbating the existing drivers. Ms. Rashima Zaid, and she holds an executive master's in managing peace and security in Africa at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies, Addis Ababa University. She's a member of the African Nazarene University Education Department Industrial Advisory Board, and also special advisor in peace and conflict studies. She is also accredited member of the FemVice Africa Union Commission. So we thank Ms. Rashima Zayed for the
So thank you, everyone. I highly appreciate you, our noble guests, my co-author and mentor, Mr. Tom Muches, and Women Without Borders, and all the other speakers. My presentation focuses more on the local dynamics, and in this regard, Africa in perspective, and how we can contextualize this paper to speak more about the real dynamics on the ground. First of all, I must agree with the previous speaker, that there is no direct causal relationship between climate change and violent extremism, although I agree that violent extremism is parasitic and clings on other issues. Extremists are very manipulative, and we see climate change as a risk multiplier to VE. Second, climate change exacerbates existing drivers of violent extremism conducive to terrorism and making communities more vulnerable to recruitment, for instance, manipulating the existing grievances as a result of climate change impacts, for example, issues to do with displacements and loss of livelihoods. So it is important that we take note of the fact that it is a conducive it has a conducive causal relationship to terrorism, and making it more vulnerable to recruitment and decreasing the resiliences of our communities. It provides fertile breeding grounds for terrorists in tapping on the weaknesses on the social, economic, and political dynamics. Sometimes people will say, if you're a peace builder, you should not engage in politics. But I think I will say, especially from what is happening in our country, Kenya, I would say politics is the pillar of all decisions, because even if it is bills to do with terrorism, they're passed by politicians and all other issues. So for me, I feel that we cannot leave out the political dynamics. So when I talk of dynamics, I include the social, economic, and also the political dynamics. So what are some of the impacts? As I said, it has to do with the livelihoods. For instance, in Africa, most of the people are depending on climate hood for their livelihoods, for instance, farming. And when there is excess drought or there is heavy floods, then their food gets spoiled in the farm. So this leads them to high poverty levels. When it comes to education, we consider issues like children not able, it's creating inequality in terms of, it exacerbates inequality in terms of not having all our children in school. We have a scenario where the communities that are already marginalized are the ones that are facing the adverse impact of climate change. And when this happens, you see that inequality, even in education, is exacerbated through not having their children in school. Maybe the schools are flooded and other reasons, as I'll keep explaining. And we also consider conflict in terms of immigration impacts. People move maybe from rural areas to urban areas. We have conflict because of scarcity in resources. But also when there is movement, we also have people with other ideologies who radicalize the communities that they meet. And when we talk of insecurity, we can speak about insecurity from various dynamics. We can speak of insecurity looking at the dimension of migration. It starts with displacement of women. Then they migrate, they are very desperate. And this is a very ripe opportunity, not only women, even youth. When they're in a state of despair, it is very easy for them to be manipulated, radicalized, and also the radicalizers are, as I keep talking, you'll be able to see these are much ahead of us because they are proactive in climate security. They are proactive in early warning. They are proactive in mitigating. Some of these loopholes maybe are found in governance. So what are some of the impacts? For example, I had already started mentioning, and I said people with low incomes are mostly affected, considering the poorest communities. It could be in rural or urban, and considering increasing existing inequalities in their livelihoods. This causes grievances and pushes them into higher levels of poverty. And also the forced evictions that are happening. If we look at it from a very sober perspective and we consider the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if people are evicted with their children from their homes, they don't know where they are going. They don't know where they'll get their next meal. They don't have their basics. So this is creating grievances that are being manipulated. I think there is need to restore human dignity in terms of even if we are trying to mitigate risk factors, the issue of considering human rights and human dignity. We should know that people are dealing with human beings and with feelings, emotions, and we have to be very careful because terrorism is a global threat, and it's a threat in Africa, generally East Africa and the Sahel. And if we are not very careful, we will give leeway for them to penetrate and even radicalize our communities further, maybe not willingly, but out of desperation. I've also spoken about inequality in education. It is not right when we have children of the more marginalized not in school. Let us consider the various conventions and of children. For instance, Convention on the Rights of the Child, rights to education, rights for them having provision of their basics. The other one is considering border security. When there is a panic in our society, there is usually illegal migration, and it can perpetrate very easily because of high levels of corruption. So we have people from all walks of life. For example, if you have women in the camps and with their children and the living conditions, they're living in deplorable conditions in the camp, they are easily taken advantage of because someone comes, they're ready to offer help. And because of corruption and porous borders, illegal migration becomes a norm. And it fuses with illicit economies. And we see how when illicit economies fuses with terrorism, we've seen this in the Sahel, for example, in Mali, in Chad, and even along the Kenya-Somali border, it happens. I did not reference it here, but it does happen. So we need to be cognizant of those factors. You also need to be cognizant that borders affect women and men differently. So we also need to be cognizant of the abuses women and young girls can go through when they are immigrating illegally. The other one is government unresponsiveness and the human rights abuses. For instance, human rights abuses could be, if the government doesn't act on early warning. As a citizen, you will question yourself, like, do they have the early warning? Do they have the data? Do they have statistics? And, it sends an indicator of various levels of weaknesses right from early warning. And so if the government is not able to act on time, it becomes a weak link to resilience. And extremists, they are very proactive. In this space, we must have very honest conversation. They tap on these weaknesses because we know of some areas where they are able to offer help, they are able to offer food, they're able to take advantage of the different seasons. For example, during droughts, they are very organized, they do farming, they're able to offer aid that the government is not offering on time to these people. So these people, our communities, especially the border community and other people who are suffering, resonate so well. They don't see the terrorists as the enemy because they are the people who come timely to assist them when they are facing all these issues. So I think the government needs to improve on their early warning mechanism. They need to also improve on their responsiveness and make sure that the dignity of citizens, the dignity of Africans, the dignity of the locals, the dignity of the communities that are more marginalized. For example, the border counties are restored and you don't leave a gap where terrorists can take advantage. I've also spoken about intersectionality between climate change and gender. The sixth one is I'm still putting emphasis on the border counties because of how, first of all, they are very much affected with the extremism. They're struggling with climate change impact, for instance, poverty. And they're now struggling with these new threats, for example, poverty, a lot of stress, not having their children in school, insecurity. So this provides ripe ground for radicalization, and it lowers their resilience and adaptation. And as I mentioned previously, there are very specific examples where the terrorists have stepped in very timely to offer solutions. They don't, when they come to offer solutions, they don't come in as friends. They're not telling you I'm a terrorist. They just say, I've come to offer aid, and nobody will refuse aid, especially if you are, even from a stranger, if you are in such circumstances, you are in a camp, you don't have food for your children, you're a woman, you're not sleeping in a safe space, you fear that you might get raped, you cannot have access to basics as simple as hygiene packs for women, and even food for their children. We have breastfeeding mothers. So it is very, very important that we wake up very fast and know that if we don't act, we will lose our communities. I think I've already spoken about the marginalized communities and how the militia groups are manipulating their grievances to build narratives and propaganda. With everything that is happening, we have to be very keen and even study the propaganda and even consolidate the propagandas that are coming up, and they resonate very well with the people, and they're creating a lot of bitterness and grievances amongst our people. And I don't want to speak so much about research, but I think my only concern will be, think about data. I think we are lacking data, and maybe that could be the reason why maybe our governments are not able to act fast. We need maybe more research to hear on local perspectives, to get data for early warning, and we just need to know why, like to complement or assist our government in terms of strengthening their early warning mechanism. So I think with the research, it is debatable. Yeah, I would leave it at that. I think with the research, more research, yes, I feel that we are late and we need to get into action. But from another perspective, I also feel that we cannot act if we don't have enough statistics, and statistics have to be not just blanket. We need to have in terms of gender and even in terms of the different demographics. So what are some of the recommendations? Intervention should be contextualized to specific vulnerabilities. Consider specificity. Individualized, they need to be individualized so that we can be able to capture on individual needs. And research has shown that radicalizers are moving away more from the push, and they're very smart. They're moving from the push and pull factors, and they are now targeting individuals so that they can win. The idea now is to win souls.
There is a connectivity problem, I think. Rishima?
I think we lost Rishima.
Yeah.
On the
So
call.
we will continue, and maybe she can rejoin during the Q&A session. We will continue our discussion, and we welcome Mr. Nofal Aboud, Executive Director of the Nordic Center for Conflict Transformation. Mr. Nofal Aboud has over 15 years of high-level supervisory and managerial work experience in peace building, conflict transformation, democracy processes, and human rights. He directed programs in conflict transformation in communities and also in prison settings in Morocco, Mali, Niger, Jordan, Egypt, and also worked in high-level positions in international organizations such as Search for Common Ground, International IDEA, Human Security Alliance. Mr. Aboud holds LLM in International Law from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London and International Master of Arts in Human Rights from Mahidol University in Thailand. Mr. Aboud, thank you for joining. From your perspective in conflict transformation and also from your observations from Middle East and Africa, how would you reflect on this topic? Could you elaborate on how we can integrate environmental security into peace-building efforts to mitigate conflict risks exacerbated by climate change? Floor is yours.
Thank you, Chopon. Thank you for the Bulan Institute for organizing this timely discussion, very important on climate change. I also would like to thank the esteemed speakers, Hima, Edith, and Thomas for their fantastic presentations. It's very hard for me to speak after them. So a lot of points that I had that I wanted to mention now, I have to scratch them because they have been mentioned wonderfully with the esteemed speakers. However, what I can do is to bring in the discussion home, like I said, and contextualize a little bit the discussion on climate change today. Well, you know, we know that today is one of the difficult moments in the world. We know that the war against the Palestinians, it's ongoing. Hundreds of thousands of people dying with evidence and discussion about the genocide in Palestine. You have the war in Yemen, in Sudan, in Ukraine. If you look at the report of the Institute for Economics and Peace, so one of our partners, and also the Uppsala project on conflict data, you will see that we are actually, this discussion is happening in time when we have about 57 violent conflicts in the world, involving 92 countries in the world. I think what is some people mention is this is one of the worst periods since the World War II. And truth be said, or the truth be asked, is how many of us today are asking about the carbon footprint in these conflicts? How many of us are asking questions about the carbon footprint in these conflicts? Just to be very, to link the climate change regarding this. And when we look at how the world is functioning and what are the strategies are out there in dealing with conflicts at the global level, we see two major strategies. And I would like to mention these two strategies to reflect, to give a framework to reflect on how to look into global efforts on climate and addressing climate change crisis. The first strategy is what they call it the stadium diplomacy. And I'm using here Professor Hamdi Abdurrahman Hassan's framework. He likes to speak about these two frameworks. The stadium diplomacy framework that is mainly used by China is about building stadiums and building infrastructures and roads, be it in Africa, the Middle East, and basically filling the gap of the US in kind of a cold cold competition in the MENA region in general in Africa. It's also used by Russia, also in Africa, but also Russia uses proxies, be it Wagner groups or others, to infiltrate and to fight the wars in other settings. But I would like to mention the second strategy, which is very important, and I would like to link it later on. Why to climate change crisis? It's about the second strategy is the gunboat diplomacy. The gunboat diplomacy has been used by the US for a long period of time, but specifically after the 9/11 attacks. And it's very important to mention how 9/11 attacks led to the militarization of the Middle East and North Africa. First, by having the task force 153, for example, which is in the Red Sea. It's the militarization of Red Sea, and it was reformed. It was the outcome of a military task force reform, and this one is looking at fighting against the Al-Shabaab and the attacks on in the sea, in the Red Sea, and so forth like that. It's about 25 countries involved in that. And the second very important issue is it was in 2007 a militarization in Africa under a US-led on AFRICOM, and it's more than 15 countries within that framework. And the third militarization in Africa is the military base in Djibouti. And this is the largest, I think, military base in Le Monnier, and it has more than 3,000 Marines. It's very important to look at how the militarization led us to fight terrorism and so forth like that, and whether we succeeded in doing so, and whether the militarization did not actually backfire on us in terms of climate crisis. A few data is that the global military is responsible of 5.5% of the global greenhouse emissions, because the military runs on fossil fuel, and a lot of people will say that why it is important. Is it a big deal? Yes, it's a big deal. It's a very big deal, and all of that is used for the military energy, for their logistics, transportation, and their equipment, and so forth like that. And it's very important to mention this because our climate agreements do not cover these military emissions. So if you look at the laws and so forth like that, we are not looking at how the military is actually part of the problem, not a part of the solution, especially that with all of this, we did not succeed actually to completely take away the terrorist groups. As a matter of fact, whether we ask a question whether these terrorist groups have been just shifting places from the Middle East, from Syria and Iraq to the Sahel region recently. Yes, and Rahima spoke about statistics, and it's very important to look at some of the report, the 2004 Climate Change Performance Index. And when you look at those climate change performance index, you will see that there is a correlation between the gunboat diplomacy and the performance in terms of climate change. You look at the list, you will be surprised that, first of all, the 3 places are not given to anybody because nobody is doing enough to take the first and second and third best place. So the climate change performance index starts actually from the 4th place. And it's very important to look at these countries, and you will see that these countries, of course, well, I'm not going to talk about the terrorists who are actually the problem, but also the way we dealt with the problem. When you look at the climate change performance index in 2024, you will see many countries that are not really involved, neither on the stadium diplomacy nor on the gunboat diplomacy. As example, of course, we will find some Nordic countries, but we will find Morocco actually in the top 6 countries doing a good net performance in terms of the climate crisis. I am not going to talk much. It's rather, we'll leave it with a few questions. Perhaps in the Q&A, we can discuss them a little bit more. One is that, how can we address the climate change? Should we address it within the military operations? Is it possible? And how can we actually decrease the impact, the negative impact of the military? I found it very hard to start speaking whether a tank is carbon neutral or carbon efficient operation. As a matter of fact, Donald Trump was making fun of this. Can we speak about how to include the climate change policies with the terrorist groups? And we start to talk to them about the climate change. This is also unlikely to happen, even though the US has changed a little bit the framework from we are not going to speak to terrorists to starting to having some kind of discussion behind the scenes. And we know, even though Taliban is not considered as a terrorist organization under the list of the US, but there was negotiations with the Taliban that are being considered as an organization that is, some people consider as terrorist organizations in Qatar. And so there is a shift. So what is the best way to address climate change in time of war and conflict? I think one of the lessons learned that we have to get out of this is that the best way to include climate change policies for wars that worsen the climates is actually not having the war in itself. And this is the new shift in the peace building field that we're waiting, peace building organizations that work for the last 20 to 40 years, waiting for a crisis to happen and try to address it rather than prevent crisis from happening in the first place. My organization, the Nordic Center for Conflict Transformation, we do speak about the everyday peace building. And what is needed is to get out from this idea of what is the hip to work on now. A lot of people speak about now, for example, about digital peace building, as if we resolve all other ones, as if we resolve the impact of climate change in time of war. We should not only speak about the other as being the problem, the terrorists, of course. We should also look inwards, our reactions to counterterrorism, if it does not backfire on us from a different aspect. And also, as peace-building organizations as well, perhaps we need a new generation of peace-building organizations that has this more a long-term commitment from preventing the crisis to happen in the first place. And I'm very happy to be in the board of the Bulan Institute that has this vision as well. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aboud, and for your important remarks. As you said, it's really hard to tackle climate change when several wars, several armed conflicts are going on. And you left open questions. I think we can discuss them during the Q&A session. So now, actually, it's time for a Q&A session with the participants. And I invite our audience to actively participate and leave your questions in the chat. But if you want to take a floor, please raise your hand and then we will give you the floor. And please engage. So I see that several questions in the chat already, but one of the speakers, if you would like to react to the questions left by the Mr. Aboud, please. So one of the questions here, Nadia is asking, do the UN member states take the climate change threat seriously in general, and do they consider the exacerbating driving factor seriously?
I can start with that.
Yes, please.
Question. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, please
It's
go.
all right. Well, if you go into our policy paper, and again, I'm not naive, I think it depends on what level of the UN, the Conference on Parties for the UN Climate Framework take it very seriously. The fundamental point in our policy paper, and also in several other discussions I've been having, and I see one of my colleagues that recently joined me at West Point on a discussion. I quoted my good colleagues at SIPRI, Stockholm Peace Research Institute. Climate change is not on the agenda of the Security Council of the UN. It starts from the top. Now, why is it not on the agenda of the Security? Well, we don't have agreement that climate change even is a peace and security crisis. I agree with Newfall's comment that here we have an opportunity to be ahead on the prevention. Does it have to be at the Security Council? No, not necessarily. But if I could look at large multilateral bodies such as the UN, I think Chopin knows, and many do, big fan of the OSCE, even NATO. Their agendas, many of them were formed 15, 20 years ago based on a world that is much different today. I am suggesting that it should at least be on the agenda. What would I love to see in a perfect world? There's a UN Counterterrorism Committee at the Security Council. I would like to see a UN Climate Change Committee being directed out of the Security Council, and at the OSCE, and at the African Union, etc. I think this is where leadership starts from the top, and I think that would make sure people understand this nexus issue of climate change and security. It ultimately, the point I made a few months ago was it would have a peace and security dividend in theory, and that if we could get ahead of the curve on this, we could redirect resources that are otherwise being used in kinetic conflicts. My 2 cents. Maybe Newfall has something to add.
Newfall?
Yes, I definitely agree with Thomas. The framework that I gave regarding the militarization for Africa, perhaps it can give us food for thought on how we can be organized as well in terms of the climate change. So instead of these task forces that are spread in Djibouti, in the Red Sea, in Africa, what we need perhaps is a framework that Thomas was talking about and having some kind of task forces on climate change. And don't wait for the UN Security Council, because themselves, they are involved in the gunboat diplomacy. And like I said, the correlation between the gunboat diplomacy and the climate change crisis is obviously very, very strong. So we need this multilateralism, but outside the framework of the UN Security Council.
Thank you very much. So there is a question for Ms. Lafar. How do you see the role of women in mitigating the climate change, exacerbation of poverty, and what specific policies could support this effort? And also, second question, I think you may answer, how can we ensure that the intersectionality of gender and climate change is adequately addressed in policymaking to build resilient and adaptive communities?
I think that the climate change issue, and I agree with the notion that the Security Council might not be the perfect place, to become a change maker in this field. So I do think we have to think more upstream. We have to consider the communities, the grassroots communities, because that's where consciousness raising takes place. And that's, of course, the big polluters are companies, are warmongers, as Nufal has pointed out, militarization, that really contributes to climate change in a big way. And individuals might have not the big role to play, but individuals who are mobilizing, who have the right consciousness at the grassroots level, who kind of link up, who create movements to tackle climate change. I think this is a starting point. And where does this start? This starts in, I think, at the grassroots, in the private sphere, where we do have to raise consciousness for the challenges. When you look, we work in Indonesia now, and when you walk through along the beaches, through the villages, in the cities, it is a disaster. It's an environmental disaster, and it makes me very sad, to watch the fishermen who have to battle through waste to go out and get their livelihood, safeguard their livelihood. It is really critical. So working with local communities, with community stakeholders, build capacity with local stakeholders. I don't think that the way is to bring in the knowledge from top down, or from the West to the global South. There is so much expertise in the global South that I think we have to tap into this existing expertise. The role I think I see for multilateral stakeholders to provide platforms, so that people come together, raise their voices, strategize, brainstorm, develop strategies, and go back and work within the communities. And I can see that in the work we're doing with the educational approach is incredibly empowering, because we work with mothers, and I will never forget, I was with government stakeholders. I think after 9/11, we developed this model after doing the research. And when we suggested to work with mothers as leaders in the family, as potentially trusted community leaders, they said, "What did we hear right? Mothers? Why? How?" Today, this is not happening anymore. So we have to look at the stakeholders who can be empowered to have influence from bottom up. And I think we have to support a grassroots movement who will take care of their own environments, but at the same time exercise pressure from bottom up. I think that those companies, military stakeholders, all these entities have to be accountable for the damage they are doing. And this is for each and every person on the ground a question of survival, particularly in the regions I've mentioned in my introductory remarks. This is absolutely a question of survival of the individuals, and also of geographies, across geographies. People have to pack up. I mean, how is it possible that villagers have to move into refugee camps, leave their houses, leave their livelihoods behind, live on a day-to-day basis, and it's not their fault. It's so I do think that this notion of helplessness has to be questioned, and the best way is, I think, the question is if it comes from the people. I think that people power counts in that respect.
Thank you very much. So we run out of time, and I'd like to thank our panelists for their invaluable insights and our audience for their thoughtful engagement. So today's discussion has underscored the urgent need for collaborative action in addressing the intertwined challenges of climate change, human security, and terrorism. The Bulan Institute will continue organizing important discussions on climate change and other security issues. Stay tuned. And the video of this event will be published on our website. Thank you for joining, and have a good day or afternoon. Bye.